Good morning, and I want to thank all of you for joining me. I'm joined here today to my left, Megan Fox, who is the Chief Deputy Attorney General for Social Justice, and Jessica Clark, who is Chief of the Civil Rights Bureau of the Attorney General's Office. The death of George Floyd last May sparked a racial reckoning within this country. We saw an incredible mass of individuals, communities of all races and ethnicity and ages and backgrounds, take to the street and march to protest the deaths of black men and women by law enforcement. As the demonstrations continued, the very thing being protested, aggressive actions of law enforcement, was on public display. My office was tasked with the responsibility of launching a civil investigation into the New York City Police Department's response to these protests. What we found was an egregious abuse of police power, rampant excessive use of force, and leadership unable and unwilling to stop it. So a few minutes ago, my office filed a lawsuit against the mayor of the city of New York, the city of New York, and the leadership of NYPD to end its pattern of using excessive force and making false arrests against New Yorkers during largely peaceful protest. In our lawsuit, we outlined years of the NYPD's illegal and harmful conduct against New Yorkers. And most recently, it's at protests that began this past May, which has led to significant injuries and violated individuals' basic rights to peacefully protest. We found that over the course of the protest from May to December of 2020, NYPD officers engaged in blatant use of excessive force and often misconduct, including the indiscriminate, unjustified, and repeated use of batons, pepper spray, bicycles, and a crowd-controlled tactic known as kettling, also referred to as containment, which caused significant physical harm. We also found that NYPD officers unlawfully detained and arrested legal observers, medics, and other essential workers, performing services without, their arrests were without probable cause and in direct violation of the executive order that was issued by the mayor of the city of New York. The complaint filed in the Southern District of New York specifically names, as I mentioned, the City of New York, Mayor de Blasio, NYPD Police Commissioner Dermot Shea, and NYPD Chief of Department Terrence Monahan. The City of New York and these individuals in their official capacities as the top policymakers for the NYPD failed to address this long-standing pattern of abuse by not properly training, supervising, and disciplining officers to prevent this misconduct, despite knowing and publicly admitting that it violated the rights of New Yorkers. This lawsuit seeks broad injunctive relief, including systemic reforms to the NYPD and a monitor to oversee the NYPD's compliance with the law and policing practices in future protest. We are also seeking an order from the court declaring that NYPD's response to protesters were in fact unlawful and in violation of their First, their Fourth, and 14th constitutional rights. Unfortunately, the NYPD's response to large-scale protest is nothing new. During anti-war protests in 2003, protesters made hundreds of complaints about excessive force, resulting in money damages against the city of New York. In 2004, NYPD employed similar unconstitutional practices at protests of the Republican National Convention, again, resulting in money damages against the city of New York. In 2011, NYPD officers used excessive and unnecessary force against protesters during the Occupy Wall Street protest, again with the same result, money damages against the city of New York. And during these years and since, the NYPD and the city have been sued many times, numerous times, for this misconduct and for arrests that lack probable cause and violate the First Amendment. Since the end of May 2020, my office has received more than 1,300 complaints and pieces of evidence about the NYPD's misconduct. We have also received 300 submissions of written evidence. We heard from over 100 individuals at our public hearing in June and subsequent investigation. And we found a pattern of deeply concerning and unlawful practices that the NYPD utilized in response to these largely peaceful protests. We found that the NYPD arrested or detained hundreds of protesters, legal observers, medics, and others without legal justification and in clear violation of the emergency executive orders from the mayor. Officers arrested individuals who were exempt from the curfew and detained and arrested individuals without probable cause that they were actively engaged in unlawful conduct. They used grossly excessive force, including unjustifiably deploying pepper spray, batons, their bicycles, and even using their fists against protesters. As a result of these actions, protesters suffered significant physical and psychological harm, including broken arms, bones, and gashes, requiring stitches and staples, concussions, and more. In total, we found over 155 incidents of officers using excessive and unreasonable force against protesters. And while these acts were abhorrent and unlawful, sadly, they are not new. For decades, this misconduct has been widely examined and reported. The NYPD has continuously engaged in similar unlawful, excessive force and false arrest practices while policing large-scale protest. And even though the NYPD knew this, they still failed to put policies and procedures in place and to discipline officers to correct these egregious actions. NYPD and city leadership even went as far as to commend the NYPD's use of kettling, otherwise known as containment, which was its strategy to corral and trap protesters. Despite the mass arrests and injuries to numerous protesters, Commissioner Shea said that the NYPD, quote, had a plan which was executed nearly flawlessly, unquote. While Mayor de Blasio was on the record saying that the use of kettling was, quote, justified, unquote, there was ample ability and opportunity for the city and NYPD leadership to make important changes to the way that officers interact with peaceful protesters. But time and time again, they did not. They did not train. They did not supervise. They did not stop officers who engaged in this misconduct, and they did not discipline them either. Instead, they failed the people of the city of New York. New Yorkers have a right to peacefully and freely protest. And the city's leaders have a responsibility to respect and protect that right. But what we saw was legal rights and protections tossed aside. We cannot say that leadership turned a blind eye to what was happening on our city streets because we know they saw it all. We all saw it. We all saw the chilling moment when protester Andrew Smith, his face mask pulled down and was then pepper sprayed directly in the face by an officer, an act that was caught on video and seen by millions. Andrew suffered from the effects of the pepper spray for days after the encounter with NYPD. After the incident, we saw body-worn footage that captured the officer who sprayed Andrew bragging that, I quote, took the guy's goggles, I ripped his shit off, and I used it, unquote. We were also able to see the moments when the NYPD in full gear charged towards protester Mr. Washar Benoit without provocation and hit him with batons on the right side of his face and elsewhere on his body. Then when Mr. Washar Mr. Benoit was visibly bloodied and disoriented after the attack. No NYPD officer sought or provided medical attention to him for the broken eye socket he suffered as a result. And we saw the aftermath of an incident that left protester Luke Hanna with 10 staples in his head after an officer struck him with a baton without provocation or justification. These incidents are as disturbing as they are unnecessary and unlawful. The simple fact is that they are not warranted and are patently illegal. We also cannot underscore the horrifying truth that individuals providing essential services such as legal observers and medics and monitors were harassed and arrested without probable cause, even though the mayor specifically exempted them from curfew orders. On May 30th, Rain Valentine, a medical worker who has been on the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis, was walking home from a shift when he witnessed NYPD officers beating up another person. Mr. Valentine recorded video of the officers with his cell phone, but as he recorded, an officer approached him and yelled at him to move back. Mr. Valentine complied, but without warning, the officer charged at him, pushed him to the ground, and multiple officers began attacking him. Mr. Valentine tried to tell the officers that he was just trying to get home. And one of the officers replied that, quote, "You picked the wrong time to do that," unquote. Mr. Valentine was beaten by the police before they abruptly stopped and walked away. Mr. Valentine then had to return to the hospital where he works and had just left to seek medical assistance for the gash on his head, which required staples to close. This unfettered conduct has gone on